distinguished guest, and for our first sessions, the sea level rise and potential legal impacts. It is our pleasure to have Professor Nguyen Thao, member of the United Nations International Law Commissions, as the moderators. And joining his companions are our distinguished presenter, Dr. Chu Tuan Đức, Deputy Director General, Department of International Laws and Treaty from the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, Vietnam, Dr. Ari Afriansyah, Associate Professor, Faculty of Law from Universitas Indonesia, Dr. Alejandra Torres Camprubi from Foley Hawaii, Professor Matlock from Kiel University, Professor Nulifo Oral, member of the United Nations International Law Commissions and Center for International Law of the NUS Singapore, and Professor Clive Schofield, Head of Research from the World Maritime University. And for our online audience, please keep in mind that you can type your questions in the Q&A box at any given time and provide the feedback at the end of the program. Professor Thao, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, good afternoon and good morning, depending to you where you are. And thank you for the participation through Zoom technology. As you know, climate change, including change in sea level, become a common concern of humankind. The new IPCC 6th assessment report in 2021 remarks that many changes due to the past and future greenhouse gas emissions are irreversible for centuries, especially changes in the ocean, ices, and global sea level. Micronesia is the first state proposed to the International Law Commission to consider the implication of the sea level rise on coastal states and island states. And you know that Asia is also a region seriously affected by the sea level, where we have Vietnam and Bangladesh, the fourth and the fifth state seriously affected in the world. Let me invite the regional expert to have a floor. Professor Arya Afriansyah, and after that, Professor Chu Tuan Đức, and international legal experts. Now, Professor Arya Afriansyah, floor for you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Distinguished panelists, professors, colleagues, I'm very honored to become the first speaker among the experts in the law of the sea. This is very unusual for me because I'm in the middle of prominent persons that the publications that I've been reading all of this time. It is an honor for me. Thank you so much. And in this very tight presentation, I would like to share my little thoughts about the sea level rise and, of course, the legal perspectives from the Indonesian side. Of course, we know that in the current studies that more and more reports saying the same structure, that having the predictions that sea level rise is actually happening, and none of those reports saying the otherwise. And unfortunately, the rise is getting worse and worse, and hopefully, not hopefully, but maybe in the next 10 years, it's going to be up until 60. And this is quite alarming for all of us. And if I may take the publication from Professor Clive Schofield with Professor David Freestone, in their article, there's a very interesting table in which I quoted in here that there are three vulnerable features, especially with the archipelagic state. They are the features that's used by the claimant state for archipelagic concept, that they're relying on these low-lying islands, reefs, and low tide elevations. And if we take a look at each of every features in here, all of them are very vulnerable in terms of the sea level rise. And at the same time, most of these archipelagic states are relying on the reefs, as we know that not only from the sea level rise, but also from the climate change, especially with the acidification of the sea, is also badly influence the reefs in terms of the features that they are relying on the baselines of the archipelagic states. And this is something that we need to pay attention on if the archipelagic states are really impacted by the sea level rise, and they have to defend their base points on this occasion. And it would be very not in a good position for these states if the sea level rise is taken into account of their defense. And if I may quote that the regional response, especially from the Pacific states, that they are hoping that the sea level rise would not be the critical points to challenge or to reduce their maritime zones, because if this is happening and it's will be included, it will be we can see more and more areas to be reduced, and eventually we will be seeing a drowning state. And this is, of course, will be impacting to the traditional what do you call it, traditional elements of the statehood itself in terms of the territory. And of course, they're trying to saying that the maritime zones that based on the small islands that could be threatened by the sea level rise should be not be challenged, or they call it as a sea level rise proof. And especially for Indonesia, I can say that we are impacted in both ways, internally and internationally. Of course, internally, as you can see that we have a very long coastline areas that are really vulnerable to disasters, and especially with the sea level rise. And more than 50% of the Indonesian people actually lives in the coastlines. And many of them are really depending on their livelihoods on these coastal communities. And of course, they are continuously experience the bad experience with the weather, with the disaster events. And of course, this will be negatively impacted the Indonesian economy and the population, especially to the natural resources and the environment. And this, of course, this hardship of this climate change and also the sea level rise has forced some people to migrate to other safer areas. So we can call it as the urbanization because of the sea level rise. But unfortunately, the big cities are eventually in the edge of, or the edge of the coastal areas as well. Especially like in Jakarta, we know that we are really struggling to make Jakarta stay afloating. This is the examples of where we experience almost every year, not only in Jakarta, but all other areas in the coastal lines of, especially in Java Island, where the rock floods always come to Indonesia. And from year to year, the water from the sea is actually going landward deeper and deeper. So more and more communities is trying to going back inward to their livelihood. But from some actors, they're trying to make a reclamation in the area of the coastal, in the north side of Jakarta. And this is something that really sad, because we found more and more cemetery drowned by the sea water. As you can see here, many of the people come to visit their family cemetery just right before the sea, and eventually in the middle of the sea right now. Yeah, this is very unfortunate. And there's a current research in Aceh from the colleague of mine in Universitas Syahkuala. They reported that the sea level rise is 1.3 millimeters per year until 1.8 millimeters per year in the last 25 years. They also reported that the temperature is increasing 0.6% in the last 10 years since 2019. They claim that the sea level rise and the local temperature are in line and show some connection. But of course, they acknowledge that they need to have a further research to confirm this one. Externally, we know that we have some areas that has not been finalized in terms of the delimitation areas. And this might be impacted if we taken into account really seriously if the age of the coastline impacted by the sea level rise. With this ongoing negotiation, especially with the EEZ and also the what we call continental shelf, with the equitable solution, this might be some factors that we might want or we might not want to bring up on the table, whether the sea level rise is taken into account. So I guess maybe the state needs a state that negotiating need to take a clear position in which base point that they need to take as their points to be this negotiation. I guess you can see all of the areas that we have not yet been delimited, and this is really a good. This is really a hard homework for the Indonesian government to negotiate. This is with the Malaysian, Philippines, Palau, and also the Timor-Leste. And for my last slide, if I may quote Mr. Sarufas from Papua New Guinea, he said that in order to foster legal certainty and stability, facilitate orderly relations between state and avoid conflict, and affected states should be able to maintain existing entitlements to maritime zones in accordance with the UNCLOS. They should be able to maintain their maritime boundaries as delimited by agreement between states or by decisions of international courts or arbitral tribunals. I guess this is my fastest presentation. Thank you so much. Back to you, Hung Thao. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Arya Afriansas, for the presentation on the sea level rise implication on archipelagic state. Now we can hear the opinion from the Cotton area expert, Dr. Chu Tân Đức, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Good afternoon from Hanoi. Schönen guten Tag. It is my honor to be a speaker at this event. And today I would like to brief you on the impact of sea level rise on maritime entitlements from Vietnam's perspective. So I hope that you can see my slide now. Okay, so my presentation consists of 3 parts. First, the inundation risks of Vietnam's coastline and baseline. Second, the Vietnam's policy to address the sea level rise. And finally, some policy recommendation. So first, I would like to examine the risks of the Vietnam's coastline and baseline under the impact of the sea level rise. So according to some research, Vietnam is among the 5 countries in the world most affected by the sea level rise. And the Mekong Delta, the biggest delta in Vietnam, is among the 3 deltas most vulnerable to sea level rise. So in the scenario that the sea level rises by 1 meter, about 17% of the Red River Delta in the north and 39% of the Mekong Delta in the south and 78% of Ho Chi Minh City, so the biggest and wealthiest city in Vietnam, will submerge. But on the other hand, I think that the Vietnam's baseline are not probably significantly threatened by the sea level rise, because Vietnam has declared the 10 base points on the islands and islets along the Vietnam's coast, which are unlikely to submerge due to the sea level rise. In the Tonkin Gulf, Vietnam has not determined any base points, but it has already concluded with China the 2000 agreement on the delimitation of the Gulf of Tonkin, and which specify the delimitation line, of which some segment is a delimitation line for the territorial sea, and the other segment is for the delimitation line of the EEZ and continental shelf between the two countries. So I do believe that in the relations between Vietnam and China, the maritime zones under the jurisdiction of Vietnam has already established and are not subject to change. But a third country not bound by the 2000 agreement may also challenge the regime of maritime zones according to the UNCLOS. As regards the offshore features, I mean the features in the paracel and spreadleys, Vietnam considers that no features enjoy the regime of full-fledged islands under the Article 121, paragraph 1 UNCLOS, as reflected in the Vietnam's Note Verbal 22 of 30 March 2020, circulated at the United Nations and to all state parties of UNCLOS. So I come to the conclusion that there may be no significant effect on the Vietnam's maritime entitlements if the current base points and the regimes of offshore features stay unchanged. So now I proceed to the second part of my presentation, as it is Vietnam's policy to address the sea level rise. So since 2011, Vietnam has adopted the national strategy to address climate change, including the sea level rise, providing for comprehensive adapting and mitigating measures, and enhance the international cooperation, including the ratification of the United Nations Frame Convention on the Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. But until now, Vietnam has not yet adopted a legal position towards the sea level rise effects on the maritime entitlements. But if we look at the land and maritime boundary agreements Vietnam have concluded with the neighboring countries, I do believe that we can find some clues. Although the sea level rise have not been considered in this agreement, they have provided for geographical coordinates for the boundaries and set the permanency of the border lines. So even any change happens to the boundary rivers, for example, which shall not result in the boundary shift. It is clearly provided for in the land and maritime boundary agreements. So it is my final part of presentation. It is a policy recommendation for Vietnam. I do think that Vietnam should take the approach proposed by the United Nations International Law Commission, the International Law Association, and the Pacific Island State to freeze the baseline and outer limits of maritime zones for the legal stability and safety, for the permanency of agreed and adjudicated boundaries, where the rebus sic stantibus is not applicable, as confirmed by the ICJ and Arbitration Tribunal jurisprudence, and also for the limited national capabilities of Vietnam. Vietnam cannot follow the example of developed countries in investment in the coastal protection as the Netherlands. So to adopt this approach the following measures should be taken. We should raise the public awareness. We should enhance the international, regional, and sub-regional cooperation to mobilize support for the approach. We should also notify the full system baseline and outer limits of maritime zones in accordance with UNCLOS. And at the same time, we should also invest in our coastal protection, at least at significant points. So this is the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you for the attention.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Chudaduk. Now we have the approach of Pacific Island State from Dr. Alexandra Torres Camburubi. Yeah, please, you have a floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Thao, distinguished state representatives and participants from all over the world. It is a real honor for me to be part of today's Ocean Dialogue, and I would like to express, of course, my sincere gratitude to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, KAS, and the British Embassy in Hanoi for the invitation and the opportunity to present on a topic that is very dear to me, which I've been following for over 15 years now, and to which I devoted my dissertation, doctoral dissertation, over a decade ago. The title of my presentation is Securing Loss of Statehood Due to Sea Level Rise Through the Protection of Maritime Entitlements. I am aware that my co-panelist professors, Nilofer Oral and Clive Schofield, will very soon address the implications that sea level rise poses for the international law of the sea, and in particular on the law on baselines, a topic that has now been under study by both the ILA Committee on International Law and Sea Level Rise since 2012 and by the ILC Study Group on International Law and Sea Level Rise since 2018. But before they do so, I thought I could take a step back and propose to put that analysis on such major evolutions of the international law of the sea into a broader framework or broader perspective, and connect those evolutions to the most extreme case scenario that sea level rise creates. And I'm referring, of course, to the danger that sea level rise constitutes to the continuity, in particular, of low-lying island states, and the challenge that sea level rise therefore represents to the traditional doctrine on statehood. As you are all aware, and of course that has already been mentioned, less than 2 weeks ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 6th assessment report with devastating results for humankind. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has described the report as a color red for humanity. And when it comes to sea level rise, the projections foreseen by the panel are that sea level will increase up to beyond 1 meter by 2100 when compared to 1995 levels. This increase virtually constitutes a death sentence for the affected states, and there is therefore no doubt that it does represent a color red for sinking island states. To understand the evolutions of the international law of the sea that are already in the works in response to sea level rise, one needs to use a magnifying glass and closely look at the legal strategies deployed by the most affected states. 4 states in the world are particularly in danger because they are exclusively or almost exclusively composed by coral islands and atolls below 10 or even 5 meters of altitude. 3 of them are located in the Pacific Ocean, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Marshall Islands, and one of them, the Maldives, is in the Indian Ocean. The influence of all 4 is, of course, magnified by the fact that they do not act alone. They have built up their strengths over the past 3 decades around key political alliances that operate before UN organs and in the mainstream climate change negotiations. I'm referring in particular to the Alliance of Small Island States and, of course, as has already been referred to, the Pacific Islands Forum, a regional organization. So far from constituting the views of a minority handful number of states, or far from constituting mere regional practice, it is my view that these states are in fact the pioneers in this realm, and the organizations they operate through are the laboratories where these experimental but already groundbreaking legal strategies are being cooked and prepared. So the first question is that arises is, how does sea level rise challenge the traditional doctrine on statehood? I always like to begin with a quote from Professor Charles Rousseau, who back in the 1970s wrote that duration is an essential element of the state. La durée est un élément essentiel de l'État. Professor Rousseau's quotes, in my view, encapsulates the traditional view of the state as a power-based institution with a vocation to persist in time. The same view that was encapsulated in the 1933 Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States. Article 1 of the Montevideo Convention, as we all know, sets forth the criteria that an entity needs to fulfill to qualify as a state: a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. And it is generally considered to be the codification of statehood. Of course, at the time when the Montevideo Convention was adopted, and also at the time when the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea was adopted, the possibility of sea level rise resulting in a loss of territory or permanent population was not yet well known. They were both based on the premise that geography was stable. But as climate change and sea level rise have become more well known, sea level rise challenges the correlation between statehood as a physical reality and statehood as a legal construct. And therefore, the question has arisen in scholarly debates on whether the mirroring effect should apply in this case. That is, whether the same criteria for determining the creation of states should apply to assessing whether a state has ceased to exist or not. And here, international legal scholars are divided. By the way, a debate that will soon go well beyond mere scholarly debates and, of course, spark fierce confrontations, I foresee, before UN organs, the UN Security Council probably included. So putting aside the debate on the legal or non-legal nature of the law on statehood, which is always a controversial area of international law, a fact that leaves no room for doubt is that the question of state creation has received much more attention in legal scholarship than the question of state extinction. And perhaps as a result of such disproportion, some authors, formalists in my view, generally consider that a state will simply become extinguished once total submergence or total depopulation takes place. Other scholars, and myself included, believe that in practice, things are not as straightforward and not so clear-cut. Professor James Crawford, who is greatly missed, devoted one last chapter of his very famous treatise on the creation of states in international law to the question of state extinction. And he pointed out, and I quote, "A state is not necessarily extinguished by substantial changes in territory, population, or government, or even in some cases by a combination of all three. This results, of course, from the fundamental role played by normative standards, the ethical and the diplomatic framework in which both claims of both access to statehood and loss of it are framed." There is also a debate on whether the presumption of continuity of statehood would be applicable, a presumption that I support and I believe is derived from international law's inherent bias towards stability and order, but the debate remains open. What is clear is that as the debate unfolds, the affected states are not passively waiting for the international community to decide on their fate. they are taking the bull by the horns, so to speak. Despite their very limited land extension, Pacific Island states benefited from the expansionist evolution of the international law of the sea towards the distribution of sovereignty and jurisdiction over greater maritime spaces, which culminated with the adoption of UNCLOS in 1982. As a result of the adoption of UNCLOS, disproportionately vast maritime spaces became available to these states, which compensated for their very limited land extension. And in some instances, coastal states would operate in a maritime area as vast as up to 300 times the extension of their land territory. So for these blue ocean states, as they often refer to themselves, the sea is both a fundamental element of their national identity and source of their livelihoods, as it is the main threat to their existence as a people and as a state. So protecting their maritime spaces and rights over such spaces is therefore of crucial importance for these states and the first step towards the preservation of their continuity. I believe this is an important point to remain in mind, to keep in mind when discussing the declaration that the Forum of Pacific Island States has just adopted 10 days ago. So the affected states have used two main legal strategies to begin protecting their maritime entitlements. The first one was the conclusion of maritime delimitation treaties. Since between 2003 and 2014, 12 new maritime delimitation agreements have been concluded in the region, 9 of them by Kiribati. The purpose of these treaties was to preserve maritime boundaries at a certain point in time. But in the absence of a maritime boundary, low-lying island states have taken unilateral measures to protect their entitlements. Particularly the publication of their baselines, followed by the omission to update such official charts. And that sort of movement is exactly what the recent declaration of the Forum of Pacific Island States has consolidated as regional practice. I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the question and exchanges thereafter.
Yeah. Thank you, Alessandra. Now, sea level rise affected not only statehood, maritime baseline and boundary, but also resource exploitation. So, may I invite Professor Nelle Masklus from Germany. You have a floor.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure if you can actually see my screen, but while I try to set this up, I want to thank the organizers for welcoming, for inviting me, and also thank the chairman for his kind introduction. I'm amazed, I have to say, first of all, to see so many colleagues from the ILA Commission on Sea Level Rise. That's not the surprise, but I'm so amazed how well all these short presentations fit together. Not knowing what everyone else would talk about, I was working on my short presentation. I thought, oh, maybe, you know, we will just double. We will all say the same. That's not the case at all. And so even online and virtually, this community seems to work particularly well. I would like to focus for the next couple of minutes on resources, and I would like to first talk a bit about resources under national jurisdiction, a few words on resources outside national jurisdiction, and on possible developments. I have not called this deliberately legal developments because we cannot be sure about that. But developments in the political arena that might turn into law eventually. So that's no surprise to most of you, learned colleagues, sovereign rights over marine resources. So the capacity to exploit resources, to exclusively exploit resources, depends upon the maritime zones in which they are found. And as a rule of thumb, we could say the closer you are to the land, the stronger are these rights and are exclusive sovereign rights or sovereignty. So this old idea, maybe it's not the best idea how to think about the ocean, but the principle that rights over the sea follows rights over the land, we see this reflected in these maritime, I would say, like to say, artificial maritime zone design of the ocean. I used to make the point that our thinking about the ocean from the land is very much a mindset, and maybe it's not the best mindset. And we see that in sea level rise, I think, quite clearly. So as a general rule, this has been said before, if a coastline changes, base points, baselines need to be adjusted. Maritime zones change accordingly. Sometimes it's said they get smaller. Well, that's not precisely the point, but they move. So while your 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone is still 200 nautical mile, it moves and its location is different. And this has implications for resources and about the availability of resources in that space as well. If islands slowly submerge, change or lose their status, this has implications for maritime zones and rights over resources. And in the questions answers, there was already a question concerning South China Sea. And let me be clear already here, that sea level rise doesn't solve any problems. Sometimes it's said, oh yes, if we lose islands, you know, it's maybe easier for maritime delimitation, or the loss of status might make it easier. I don't think that this is the case at all. If single islands disappear, the coastal state can no longer claim the previously established maritime zones around the submerged feature under current international law. So this is clearly a loss of resources for those states who are particularly affected by sea level rise. And then that has been mentioned by Alejandra, the issue of statehood. So if an island state or an archipelagic state loses all of its territory, statehood under current international law would cease to exist. And we also have the difficult situation that somewhere in between the status now and the complete loss of all territory, we have the situation that there may still be land, but it's no longer inhabitable. So that's the situation for resources which are currently under national jurisdiction of states affected by climate change, by sea level rise. If we talk about resources outside national jurisdiction, sea level rise could to some extent reverse this trend of encroaching jurisdiction by coastal states, of putting more and more water under national jurisdiction by making the space, if the baselines and the maritime zones move with sea level rise towards, with the coast, with the receding coast, the space that is governed as an area outside national jurisdiction gets larger. Again, I don't think that solves any of the problems because the regime we have for resource exploitation, for protection of areas beyond national jurisdiction, high seas in the area, may not be the best with regard to sustainability. So resources that had formerly been managed under national jurisdiction might now come under different legal regimes. One point here, together with other effects of climate change, permanent migration of fish stocks, there could be new opportunities for high seas fisheries. In the Arctic Ocean, states have agreed on a Arctic Ocean fisheries agreement that gives a kind of a moratorium of commercial fishing to prevent IUU fishing until the science is done. But the question in the context of sea level rise is who participates and who benefits from this development. And as the law is now, it's certainly not those regional states that have been affected by sea level rise. That brings me to my last slide and points. One issue, of course, is maintaining maritime zones, maintaining entitlements to resource exploitation for coastal states by freezing the zones, by freezing baselines or the outer level of the zones. This has been mentioned. Another idea I want to put forward is to establish exclusive historical, traditional fishing or exploitation rights in areas which were formerly under coastal state jurisdiction around submerged islands, for example. That could be an idea. So while the maritime zone formally shifts in accordance with UNCLOS, the fishing rights or exploitation rights are maintained. And the question I want to put up here is, could there be regional solutions? Could there be some kind of trusteeship over resources by particular affected regional states that would now come under high seas fisheries or under the area, but that should, because of sea level rise, be governed regionally? And that I'm open to any questions and discussion in our discussion session later on. Thank you very much.
So thank you. Now we invite Professor Oran.
Thank you so much. And it's really a great honor to be part of this very important session. And I'm really delighted to be with such eminent experts on this topic of sea level rise, which unfortunately is a reality that will be with us for some years to come, as we know from the most recent IPCC report. So today, in the 8 minutes I have, what I'm going to do is talk about the role of the International Law Commission, which I am a member, and which my very dear colleague, Hong Tong Nguyen, is also a member, and an active member, a very important member of our study group. So very quickly, let me just get to this. Hold on a second. All right. So, of course, the International Law Commission. I just wanted to stress here, and I'm not going to read everything that are on my slides, but as we know, the International Law Association has, since 2012, really done some important work on sea level rise, and we have 2 members here at least, Professor Schofield and also Alejandra Torres-Cambruba, who just spoke. The difference with the International Law Commission is that it is a body, it is a subsidiary body under the UN General Assembly, and it has a specific mandate, which is the progressive development of international law and its codification. It has a direct relationship with states, and this is important because the work of the Commission really is commented on by states, is taken into account by the Commission, and ultimately, the ultimate approval adoption will be the 6th Committee and the General Assembly. So this is why the role of the International Law Commission in taking up this topic is important. And I have to say the Commission acted very swiftly. In 2017, it was raised. We got very positive feedback from states in the 6th Committee. In 2018, we placed it on our long-term work program. And then in 2019, on the active work program, we created a study group with 5 co-chairs. And the topics were law of the sea, protection of persons, and loss of statehood. I'm co-chair with Bogdan Oresko on the sea level, on the law of the sea aspects. And in 2020, we issued our first issues paper. However, due to the pandemic in 2020, the ILC did not meet. So we were unable to have our first meeting of the study group, that is the open-ended study group on sea level rise, until this year. And it was just, as my dear colleague knows, we just had our first meeting in June and July. And I have to say that if you're really interested, the advanced version of the annual report of the ILC is out. And Chapter 9 is the part of the study group, which I think would make some interesting reading. So just to the issues, and I think that we've already had a wonderful explanation of the key issues concerning maritime boundaries and entitlements. And I listened very carefully to that by particularly Indonesia and Vietnam, and my dear colleague who just spoke before me. very simply speaking, the issue concerns what happens to the maritime entitlements. When we're speaking about the possible loss of base points and baselines, what it means is the possible reduction, or if we're talking about islands turning into rocks, actual loss of very valuable maritime entitlements, those access to both living and non-living resources that I'm not going to go into detail, but I just wanted to highlight that. And what that means is that in terms of the maritime zones, and it just follows up very nicely on the presentation we just had, is that if there is a shift of the baseline, what it means that there will be a change, the landward shift, where internal waters will become territorial seas, and that changes the legal regime. But the most important one, in my view, is what happens if part of the exclusive economic zone becomes high seas, because we could not have two more different regimes than those two, from the open access regime to that where the coastal state has exclusive sovereignty rights over a vast area, particularly we're talking about, we call large ocean island states, of course. So the diminution or the loss can be quite significant. And this is why the issue is so vital, so important for states and impacts. Archipelagos, we just had an excellent presentation on that. And I have to read, I have not read the article by Professor Schofield and David Freestone, and I will, because I know it will be a very insightful one. But these are significant issues, the loss of an archipelagic state baseline and archipelagic waters. Again, we are talking about actual loss of resources. The loss of status of an island, these are issues that we need that are not answered in the Law of the Sea Convention, frankly. What happens? Does an island that has all the maritime zones devolve into a rock? Should it become uninhabitable? And I can't see the clock, so I'm going to look very quickly. Oh, 2 minutes, okay. So here we have these issues. So what about the role of the International Law Commission? And I know Professor Schofield will hopefully give us a more technical explanation of these. Our mandate is the progressive development of international law and its codification. So preservation of maritime zones, and this is the key issue, should be looked at, of course, as part of progressive development of international law. The law of this, Article 15 of the ILC statute actually gives guidance on what is meant by progressive development of international law. It is not an exclusive definition, but basically what it looks at is, it means that it's actually developing instruments where perhaps the law has not quite developed crystallized into what would be customary international law. There's an emerging practice, a development of practice. And so this is why the International Law Commission can look at these issues, although right now we're just doing a mapping of the issue, but I think in the future that could change. I also want to make one point in how we look at adaptation. And this is not about the International Law Commission. This is something that I've been looking at. We usually look at adaptation to sea level rise through taking either physical measures, natural ones, or artificial. But what about legal adaptation? Could we also look at actions to preserve maritime zones as legal adaptation measures? We have just heard the Declaration on Preservation of Maritime Zones by the Pacific Island Forum. This is a very important development. And again, looking at it in terms of progressive development of international law, and also an important measure for adaptation through legal measures to this problem that many states are facing, that are going to have impacts on their livelihoods. And therefore, we really do need to find practical solutions, and international law should be part of that. And I certainly hope that the International Law Commission will play an important role in finding those solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Julia Oran. We have the approach of the International Law Commission. And now I want to invite Professor Clive Skype. Yes. For Professor Clive Sofield, sorry, yeah, for his attitude as a member of the International Law Association. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And what I would like to ensure is that you can see my full screen. Very good.
Yes, 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 very clear. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's a delight to be among old friends and new, and the distinguished colleagues on both on the panel and participating in this ocean dialogue. And thank you. I echo the other presenters in terms of thanking the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for the opportunity to talk to you for a few minutes this morning for me, the afternoon and evening for some of you. Now, there's a degree of overlap with what my presentation and my colleagues, but I hope to articulate or illustrate some of the issues that we have yet to address. I did think it was appropriate. We mentioned, several of my colleagues have mentioned the IPCC's latest release of Climate Change 2021, one phase of the 6th assessment report process. And to draw just a couple of highlights from, I think, 3,949 pages of text from that report, 2 key points regarding sea level rise: that we see a significant acceleration in the rate of rising sea levels, and also the perspective that we are committed to this sea level rise, regardless of which emission scenario the IPCC looks at, significantly far into the future. So the implications for baselines, limits and boundaries, the traditional viewpoint and the view reached by the Baselines Committee of the ILA, Baselines and International Law, is that the normal baseline is ambulatory, that it can move. We've known for a very long time that the coastline is a dynamic land and landform and component of the land and seascape. And traditionally we define an envelope of arcs for our zones of maritime jurisdiction at set breadths. So that could be a 12-mile limited, nautical mile limited territorial sea, or a 200-mile limit to an exclusive economic zone. And because of depositional processes, naturally we may end up with an extension of the coastline seaward, and as a consequence of that, an extension in maritime entitlements also, in line with the land dominating the sea. But with the context of sea level rise, and the concern here is that increasing inundation of the coastline, then we'll see a retreat in the position of the coast, and therefore the low water line consistent with the Article 5 normal baselines. And as a knock-on impact from that, the potential for not only the loss of land territory on the coast, but also loss of maritime entitlement. And associated with this, as Nilofer just mentioned, the potential impact on the habitability of islands, and potentially also whether certain features need to be reclassified from fully entitled islands to mere rocks consistent with Article 121, paragraph 3, or to low tide elevations or entirely subsurface features. And that is an illustration of that, which I will, since I have the timer on me, I can see I'm already halfway through without getting halfway through my slides. What I did want to highlight, though, is we've had a couple of mentions already of the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Ocean Statement on securing the Blue Pacific. Specifically, there is a commitment towards a collective effort, including the development of international law, that will aim in ensuring that once forum members' maritime zones are delineated in accordance with the convention, then they cannot be challenged or reduced as a result of sea level rise and climate change. And this is the legal adaptation, perhaps, that Professor Oral was talking about. Certainly, there have been multiple declarations and attempts to overtly fix the baselines, limits, and boundaries of Pacific Island states. The question for us in our legal debates is whether those unilaterally declared limits will actually be respected, will be opposable to other states, and will the international boundaries that are delimited, even though the features that generated the entitlement potentially lose that entitlement, whether they will remain in place. Well, with respect to international boundaries, they have a privileged position in the international law of treaties, and that applies not just to land boundaries, but to maritime boundaries. That certainly was the viewpoint reached by the tribunal in the Bangladesh-India case. And certainty. Now, the International Law Association Committee on International Law and Sea Level Rise took the view that baselines and limits that are established in keeping with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea should not be required to be recalculated, even if sea level change results in a change in the physical geographical reality of the coastline. But how are we to achieve this? It seems that the options that we have that have been discussed is the fixing of baselines and therefore limits and boundaries calculated from those baselines, or alternatively fixing the outer limits to maritime claims. The emergent state practice in the Southwest Pacific region is to fix baselines, limits, and boundaries, sometimes in excruciating levels of detail in declarations to the United Nations Secretary General through the Division of Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea. On this graphic, you see all of the light blue shaded jurisdictions. There have been declarations deposited with the United Nations Division of Ocean Affairs and the Law of the Sea. But what are the potential pros and cons associated with that fixing? If we fix the baseline along the coast and we then generate a 12-mile limited territorial sea, a 200 nautical mile limited exclusive economic zone, and we experience sea level rise, then we have a situation where the water on the landward side of the baseline would presumably become internal waters, and we would see a divergence between the physical reality of the coastline and the declared baseline. So challenging the maxim that the land dominates the sea. Alternatively, if we fix, for example, the territorial sea limit and we experience sea level rise, we'll end up with an overt contravention of the terms of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, because the limit of the territorial sea would exceed 12 nautical miles. Similarly, if we fix the limits of the exclusive economic zone, and then we experience sea level rise and a retreat in the location of the baseline, then the limits would be of the EEZ would be beyond 200 nautical miles from baselines. So one of the debates that we potentially can have in the question and answer session is which of these options actually does least damage to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that, I believe, is time's up. Thank you very much indeed for your kind attention. And we look forward to the Q&A.
You're still muted.
Professor Thao, you are muted.
Sorry. Yeah. So we have a very interesting presentation. And now to save the time, I declare to open the question and answer section. We have 60 minutes for the question and answers here. So I please audience to have a question by raise your hand. Yeah. To use the button, raise your hand or send the message to the chat and a question and answer the bots. So I have also some question from audience now. The first question. I think that is from the Vietnamese journalist. Yeah. Miss Phạm Thị Bắc Hà. Yeah. She want to now can give me an overview on the impact of sea level rise on legal status of geological structure in South China Sea. Yeah. I think that this question is relevant for Professor Nilüfer Oran and Professor Clive Schofield. Yeah. I think that she want to address the land reclamation of future in the South China Sea. It draws a lot of concern of state around. So that's Professor Oran and Professor Clive Schofield can clarify the impact of sea level rise on the legal status of island rock and low tide elevation in South China Sea. Yeah. And the second question, I will address to Professor Masloch and Dr. Alexandria. The question that's the relation between sea level rise and climate change, hotter and hotter day by day, legal policy to decrease the heat, national and international and policy. So that is a relationship between the climate change, gas emission and sea level rise. So do you understand the question? Yeah. So now I open the floor for Professor Nilüfer Oran for the first question, and after that, Professor Clive Schofield.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that question. But I'm going to actually let Professor Schofield go first, because he is really the expert on this. And I'm happy to add a few words afterwards, given that you've invited me, but I really think he's the appropriate person in this. So please, my dear colleague.
Thank you, Nilüfer. That's very noble of you. But what I would say in principle, it doesn't, to answer that question, I would do so in a way that doesn't only apply to the features in the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands in particular. If we take the traditional interpretation of Article 5 and providing for an ambulatory baseline, then rising sea levels can have significant impacts on insular features, particularly low-lying insular features, and many coral reef islands and atolls are very low elevation. We can foresee the potential for reduced habitability, reduced ability for economic life to occur on a particular feature, and as a consequence of that, the potential to reclassify a feature from being a fully entitled island to a mere rock, consistent with Article 121, paragraph 3, or even a very low elevation feature becoming submerged at high tide, and as a consequence becoming a low tide elevation subject to Article 13 of the Convention, or ultimately over a longer period of time, becoming a fully submerged feature belonging to the seabed. However, two points to make about that. Firstly, the coastal state in possession of a feature with sovereignty over it could undertake action to try and preserve that feature above high tide. Reclamation activity, there we would look to the awarded tribunal in the South China Sea case that indicated through such human intervention, one cannot change the underlying legal classification or status of a particular insular feature. So one cannot upgrade a piece of the seabed into being an island, since an island needs to be naturally formed. And equally, one cannot upgrade a mere rock into a fully entitled insular feature, capable of generating a full suite of maritime zones. But what I would also urge is some caution about the analysis or broad-scale analysis of multiple features or entire coastlines subject to sea level rise, because each individual coastline has unique morphology, unique coastal ecosystems that may very well adapt and change in response to changing sea level. There are complex feedbacks between the shape or morphology of the coastline and islands and changing sea level, and certain valuable ecosystems, including coral reefs, such as those in the South China Sea, or mangroves, have the capability to autonomously adapt in situ and elevate themselves in response to changing sea level. So we need to be quite cautious about broad statements about coastlines and features disappearing as a direct consequence of sea level rise. Yes, there is absolutely a major threat, but certain ecosystems, certain coastlines will be able to, or can potentially adapt to changing sea level. Nilofer.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and you can see why Professor Schofield should have gone first. I will just add this, and I think when we talk about the South China Sea, I just wanted to raise the Arbitral Award, which is very interesting and important because it's the only one that went into great detail about explaining what the difference is or how to assess whether an offshore feature is a full-fledged island entitled to all the maritime zones or a rock or a low tide elevation. And for purposes of sea level rise, what's relevant is that it looked to past evidence. And it's important whether it wasn't a question of simply, is it now habitable, but was it habitable in its natural form? And this is a whole other issue about artificial islands, artificially enhancing. But I think when we look at sea level rise and the question of islands and rocks, it's important because that means that, and I say, once an island, always an island. Therefore, if you see that this has been habitable, no question about it, it's a question of preserving that legal status. So I think that's something very important that we can take from the South China Sea, but it's one case. We need to have more on that, actually. And I was going to say one more thing, but now I forgot. So I'll let others speak. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah. So now on the second question, please, Dr. Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Professor. So if I understand correctly, your question was, which are the legal strategies or policies to tackle climate change and sea level rise that states are currently taking nationally and at the international level. Of course, the main course of action is being led through the mainstream international climate change negotiations. We have the COP26 awaiting to take place in November 2021 in Glasgow. And I suppose, well, I foresee, of course, that the recent release of the sixth assessment report of the IPCC will have a very big political impact in the state representatives present at the negotiations. The point where we are at now in the negotiations of the climate change regime is quite key and has really shifted in the past 10 years a lot. Before 2009, before the Copenhagen conference, the heavy workload on adopting national strategies that would mitigate the emission of greenhouse gases was on developed states. That's how the UNFCCC was framed. Developing states did not have mitigation obligations. But that changed in the course of the Copenhagen conference and later in 2010 with the Cancun agreements. where it was accepted that developing states with the support of developed states would also present national, what were known as NAMAs. And at the same time, so they would start assuming mitigation obligations also, and in parallel, developed states assumed a second round of mitigation obligations for the second commitment period in the so-called Doha Amendment. So that was sort of crystallized and confirmed in the Paris Agreement of 2015. And at the moment, we are in agreement that all states have an obligation, have mitigation obligations, even if with differing, at different levels, taking into account both their contribution to the issue and their capabilities. That's, I think, an introduction to the issue. I let my co-panelist, Professor Matsu, continue. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Alejandra. Yes, maybe I can just add a little bit to it. Most has already been said, but since the regimes in climate change and the law of the sea are naturally interrelated, although they have not really interacted or responded too well to one another. And I think we need both. We need action under the climate change regime, but we also need action under the law of the sea regime and legal changes, hopefully in creating a synergy. And I think that the link between the two here is adaptation, and not only adaptation in a physical sense, but also adaptation in a legal sense. And this is, I think, where potential changes to the law of the sea regime comes in, because if we the original idea of adaptation was to protect against the effects of climate change, to build higher dams around the islands. And I think to protect livelihoods, to maintain entitlement and eventually statehood in some form, maybe not the territorially based statehood we see at the moment, but some other kind of statehood, we need legal adaptation. And this is, I think this can be justified if we propose changes to the law of the sea regime. One justification, one driver, one element of evolution or dynamic development is the law, is a climate change regime and the idea of adaptation. I think that could be a powerful way forward on the political level, but also on the legal level. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marles. Yeah. Now I have one question from Ekaterina Kudunova to Professor Arya Arfiransaks. Yeah. I wonder if there is any discussion of the problem of sea level rise within ASEAN going. For example, priority blue economy and ocean related issue. Yeah. Professor Arya Arfiransaks. Yeah. So that's the sea level rise from the approach of ASEAN.
Okay, can I answer now?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much for the question. Yes, indeed, the ASEAN countries, especially Indonesia, is now trying to endorse the blue economy, in which we are very much now looking forward to many unexplored potential within our ocean. But then with these topics that we are discussing right now, I guess it's a pressing issue for us is whether or not we're going to defend the frozen base points, like Professor Schofield has mentioned before. Which one that we should froze? Is it the baseline or the territorial waters and so on? But I guess as for ASEAN, I think it's going to be another regional approach in which it's going to contribute to the development itself, just like the Pacific Forum has done with their declaration. I guess it's going to be also another contribution if the state states within ASEAN wish to gather to talk about this. So I guess from Dr. Chu Tan-Duk, maybe you can add on this one, whether the diplomatic corps have an intention to have this collaboration or even discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So now I have also one question to Professor Matluek from Bryce Cocafield. Yeah, he said that, is there emerging international law on permanent maritime boundary? The Pacific Island Forum nations have made a recent declaration supported by New Zealand that once the Pacific Island have established and notified maritime zone to the Secretary General of the United Nations, they will be fixed irrespective of change to the shape and size of islands. Is that a totally untenable position, or do you think might it change the way future maritime claims are defined? Yeah, so that's a question about
yes, thank you.
position. Yeah. Yes,
thank you. I think Clive has already answered that in his presentation, also with showing the different effects of whether we freeze baselines or we freeze outer limits, and it is something that is discussed in the legal realm, in the political realm. And I think there's another question somewhere in the questions and a section to say, well, what is this? What could this be? Would this be an interpretation of the Law of the Sea Convention? I would have my doubts here. According to the rules and interpretation, it would be very dynamic. I'm a great fan of dynamic interpretation, but that might really go beyond. Or would that be evolving customary international law, or at least regional customary international law? I don't have an answer to that. It could also just be a kind of national practice that meets with a tacit agreement, with acquiescence by other states, that may or may not eventually turn into customary international law. But I think there's some kind of a gray zone of an accepted practice that may be informal in breach of the Law of the Sea Convention, but that is not where there are no claims and no dispute settlement to actually have this evaluated. So a kind of a lingering in a legal gray zone with a more and more established practice. That would be my presumption, but I don't have my crystal ball with me today.
Yeah, thank you. Now I see a hand raised from audience. Yeah, may I ask Dr. Thao from Vietnam? Dr. Thao.
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, thank you all speakers for your excellent presentation. My name is Thao. I'm from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam. And my question goes to Professor Matluek. You said that with sea level rise, traditional fishing rights can be maintained, even though the maritime zones might be shifted. So I wonder whether you could further elaborate on that point. Is it allowed under UNCLOS for states to do so when their maritime zones are shifted? And are there traditional fishing rights in the high seas? And if states can maintain traditional rights to fishing, can they also maintain traditional rights to non-living resources? Thank you.
Yeah. Hi. What do you want to address the question to Professor Yulifa Oran? Yeah.
No, I asked the question to Professor
Matluek. Yeah.
Because she
Professor
mentioned
Matluek.
that traditional fishing rights can be maintained, even though the maritime zones might be shifted. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you
Professor
for the question. Yes, well, that's one idea, and this is why I put the question marks. You couldn't see that because you couldn't see my slides. Apparently, I could see them very well on both of my screens. My apologies for that. I put question marks behind the ideas that are more explorative, and I think. Well, so far, reference to historic fishing rights, to traditional fishing rights have played a role in, for example, maritime boundary delimitation. It's not that this principle is an accepted principle of law that would guarantee maritime entitlement that extends the Law of the Sea Convention. So at the moment, I don't see this backed in the Law of the Sea Convention. So if we would shift baselines and maritime zones, and what used to be the exclusive economic zone of a coastal state now is the high seas. It depends. It's basically an open access resource. It depends on regional fisheries management organization, how fisheries are managed. But it could be one idea between the freezing of the baselines, which would clearly be give more entitlement, or would be more secure for the coastal state, and just shrugging our shoulders and say, well, it's high seas now. It's first come, first serve, basically. To give preference and to maintain exclusive rights for those who have historically fished there, because at that point, historically or traditionally, it has been exclusive jurisdiction of that state. So, but at the moment, it's not. This concept is not backed by our international law, but it could be. I think it could be a way forward to find a compromise between the different concepts that are out there at the moment. But it's certainly less. It's certainly less than freezing maritime zones, where then the exclusive rights are absolutely clear.
Thank you. Yeah. So now, may I ask Mr. Pham Don Chang from Berlin? Do we have a question? Okay. Mr. Pham Don Chang from Smart Plan Foundation for International Peace and Rule of Law. And she has a question to Professor Schofield. As you mentioned in your presentation, we are kind of struggling to find a way to deal with sailor rights without damaging the dignity of unclothed. What do we think about another approach to ocean governance apart from zonal approach provided in unclosed ecosystem approach or other, for example? Professor Sophie.
Thank you very much indeed, and that's a really good question, because essentially those scenarios that I outlined with the little animations at the end of my presentation illustrate that each of the options has, yes, some pros, some advantages, but also significant drawbacks. I tend to agree with Professor Matzluck, if I understood your intervention moments ago, but I think that fixing the actual baselines and thereby the limits measured from them actually does the least damage to the convention, undermines the convention the least. You could make the argument in interpreting Article 5 on normal baselines that it's a choice of the coastal state to do so. There is no specific low water line that is prescribed within Article 5. It's left open to interpretation. So you could argue that it is up to the coastal state to define its baseline. Whether that baseline will be one that is challenged by other states and the limits derived from it, but challenged by other states, we would have to kick that particular can down the road, and probably we will end up with a future instance, for example, of a fishing vessel being apprehended just within the 200-mile limit from a baseline that is declared, but the physical reality of the coastline has changed, and then whether the international tribunal that's brought before has the option to take a ruling. And so the international law of the sea on this issue will develop over time. But I am of the view that the Pacific Island states particularly have to sidestep one of the major criticisms of fixing baselines on charts as being a threat to safety of navigation, with the charts not reflecting the reality of the coastline. Because they haven't issued charts with their declared baselines. What they've done instead is deposit coordinates representing those baselines with the UN Secretary General through DOLOS. So there has been a way to sidestep the issue of the charting concerns. So already we have practice accreting on this. Of course, we may see that custom forming on a regional basis, but of course that's not really good enough for these states. Ultimately, in terms of marine resources for these Pacific Island states, we're talking about fish. We're talking about tuna fundamentally, and our concern there would be whether distant water fishing nations would respect those declared limits. But I do think that the declaring baselines and therefore limits and boundaries is likely the least problematic way forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. Now I have a question to Dr. Alexandra Tausek Kamburuli. Yeah. From Mark Hoskin. I wonder if we will reach the point where a naturally formed island that is impacted by sea change will be able to retain its status through legalized unnatural island building. Yeah. So that's the question about the state identity, yes, statehood.
Thank you very much, Professor. Yes, thank you for that question. I replied in the chat, just indicating that, to my knowledge, that this is already a reality, and I thought of the example of Japan and the very substantive economic resources it uses to maintain Okinawa Island afloat, a key feature for the projection of its maritime entitlements. I wasn't aware that China had challenged the status of legal status of Okinawa as an island, but I've been informed through the chat that it has. So that, I mean, is at this point at least the way that states are dealing with possibly with key, islands that are key to their maritime entitlements that they may be losing. They're just injecting a lot of money and trying to protect through engineering devices the actual feature. That has also been done, by the way, not just for single islands, but for island states. For instance, of course, the capital of the Maldives, Malé, is surrounded by a coastal wall that is now key to its survival and to protect also its airport, the same in Mahuro's airport in the Marshall Islands. So to what extent the physical protection through these engineering devices will protect the maintenance of the legal status is open to debate, and I don't think it's a question that can be answered from a strictly legal perspective. It is more of a question that will evolve in the political realm, and therefore also the geopolitical imbalances, checks and balances surrounding each of those features will also have a key impact in how successful these efforts are or are not.
Thank you. Yeah. So now I have a question to Professor Ari Afriansah and Dr. Chu Tuấn Đức from Mr. Nguyen Toàn Thắng. Yeah. In your opinion, what are the best legal options for the Southeast Asia state in the face of sea level rise? Professor Ari Afriansah.
Well, I think it's no different with other coastal states. I think it's going to be two approaches, the mitigation and adaptation, and especially with the legal approach. And I guess every state has their own ways of how to deal with their own community. But again, in terms of the delimitation, I think it's going to be a pressing issue for whether or not we're going to revisit the treaty or not, or even for those who are not delimited yet. Thank you, Professor Thao.
Yeah. Dr. Chu Tuấn Đức.
Yes, from my point of view, I think that we should follow the approach proposed by the International Law Commission, the International Law Association, and the Pacific Island State, that we should follow the way to freeze the baseline and the outer limits of the maritime zones. Mm-hmm. As I have presented in my presentation for the sake of legal stability and certainty. And we all know that the Southeast Asian nation do not have the technical and financial capabilities to make big investment in the coastal protection. We cannot follow the ways of the Netherlands, for example. But on the other hand, I do think that we also have to have a plan B, because we don't know if the notion of legal fiction can be accepted by the international community when the baseline departs significantly from the reality. So I do think that we should also make investment in the significant points of the coast, so that there is no significant deviation between the legal baseline and the reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Chu Tuấn Đức, yeah, about his proposal on the legal fiction and legality certainty. And I have also question to Professor Nilüfer Oran and Professor Clive Sophie from Mr. Chen Minh. The first question, as no state wants its maritime zone to be narrowed down or disappears due to the sea level rise, it seems that there is a consensus among states that, subject to certain possible exceptions, the sea level rise should not in principle cause a change in maritime limit. What can we characterize this consensus? It is evidence of unemerging customary rules or uninterpretation of, or modification of unclosed. Yeah. So the question is very academic, yeah, about the customary rule and interpretation and modification of unclosed in face of sea level rise. Yeah. So I think that yes, the question. Yes.
To take this one and go first.
Yes. I think that Ms. Oran is the first. Yes.
Thank you so much, Clive, for that. No, that's a very good question. First of all, I think we have to be cautious about saying that there is consensus among states concerning the preservation of maritime zones. There is certainly an emerging practice from the Pacific Island states, and perhaps that will be followed. However, where we do see a consensus is that, and you look at the statements of the Sixth Committee, is that all states are in favor of stability certainty, and predictability, and certainly peaceful relations. The question is, what does that mean exactly? So stability, certainty, predictability for some means simply, of course, preserving the Law of the Sea Convention. We talked about that, the integrity. It also means then preserving existing rights. And I underline that because what we have to also realize when we're talking about preserving maritime zones or the status of islands, these are those that have been lawfully established and recognized. And I think that's really key. So there's consensus on that. And in terms of the law of the sea, to be quite honest, it's not that clear. So when we talk about, Article 5 ambulation, when we talk about updating charts, even this distinction made between safety of navigation and the notification aspect of maritime zones with the Secretary General, that's not that clear. Does Article 5 expressly require ambulatory baselines? That is really interpretation. Do you have to update your charts? That's interpretation. People have different interpretation on that. So I think we should make that very, very clear that it's not a question of changing the Law of the Sea Convention. It's a question of interpreting it. And I also want to make another point in this. It is not the only source of law either. And the Law of the Sea Convention makes that. And I think my dear colleague is the one who brought this up in the commission. My dear colleague, Ambassador Nguyen, that the Law of the Sea Convention says, hey, if it's not addressed by the Law of the Sea Convention, you can look to other sources of rules in international law. Equity, big issue as well when we're talking about these. So historical rights, there's so much to this. So just to say that when we're talking about consensus and stability, consensus, it's not clear, and we have to work on that. And the Law of the Sea Convention is an important starting point, but it doesn't answer our questions, which is why we're here, frankly. So I will now turn over to my dear friend, Clive.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nilüfer. That I just take up the point you really emphasized is about existing entitlements the states have. And if we go back to it's of course only one case, the South China Sea case. It's only binding on the Philippines and China, but it is the only detailed judicial interpretation of Article 121. So it provides us with some guidance here, particularly looking at threatened islands. There is a clear articulation that no, one cannot upgrade an island, as it were, or feature from low tide elevation to rock, from rock to fully entitled island. However, there was a strong emphasis within the reasoning of the tribunal towards weighting historical evidence of human habitation and economic life as establishing that a particular feature was capable of being classified as a fully entitled feature, able to generate continental shelf and EEZ rights. And that, I think, is to some extent forced upon the tribunal as a consequence of large-scale island building obliterating the natural condition of certain features. But it also points us towards a means of analyzing features being able to retain their existing position, their existing status and entitlements. And I think that reasoning is quite supportive of the idea of classifying of states being able to retain what they already possess in terms of their maritime entitlements, faced with the threat of rising sea levels and a potential retreat of their baselines.
Thank you, Clive. But you have also another question from Konstantinov Rider, from the British Institute of International Law. Yes, the question that.
Yes.
Yes,
and
yes, okay.
For that question, I answered it in the chat. I'm not sure whether everyone can see the answer.
Yeah.
In essence, the issue there is around. I'm paraphrasing you, Konstantinos, but islands in the future with human intervention becoming less and less natural in character, and therefore an issue there around whether in the future features would be able to be, how features should be classified where they've been substantially altered in their character, and whether the Article 121 comes under pressure, as Konstantinos put it. I think going back again to the reasoning of the tribunal in the South China Sea case, the emphasis was on historical capacity and trying to analyze features in their natural state. That will increasingly become harder and harder to do, but nonetheless, there is historical evidence that can be drawn upon. And the South China Sea Tribunal went back to evidence that was almost 150 years old in order to underpin its reasoning around the features in the South China Sea.
Thank you. Yeah. So now because the second section is the freedom rights. So that we talk a lot about the maritime delimitation, maritime baseline, fishing rights. Now I have a question to all of you about how do we think about the effects, the implementation of the sea land right on the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. So that, yeah. So I invited Arya first.
Freedom navigation relates to the regime that we know, especially on the high seas, so that it depends on which one that we're going to express our intention to deal with this development, whether we're going to extend or we're going to adjust the baseline again, as Professor Scofield has mentioned. As the proponent of UNCLOS, Indonesia has always been adamant to adhere to what has UNCLOS said, and we are not trying to modify it or whatsoever that has UNCLOS has decided upon that one. Thank you, Professor Wong Thao.
Yeah, Dr. Chu Tiên Đức.
Thank you. But I wonder if the sea level rise could have any effect on the freedom of navigation, because we all know that the freedom of navigation exists also in the territorial sea in the form of the innocent passage. So, and as far as the Spratleys Islands are concerned, we can refer to the Arbitration Tribunal awards that no features in the Spratleys enjoy the status or the regime of the fully entitled islands. So even in the case that the coastal state claims that the territorial sea is something exclusive and as hindrance to the freedom of navigation, I do believe that in Spratly Islands, it has no big effect, at least no big effect. And as to the Paracel Islands, from Vietnam perspective, as I have said that Vietnam does not consider any feature in the Paracel Islands as island under Article 121, paragraph 1, UNCLOS. So it is the same as in the Spratly Islands. So in conclusion, I do think that it has at least no significant effect on the freedom of navigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chu Tiên Đức. Now, Professor Alexandra.
Thank you, Professor. I think the question to just bring it a little bit to the topic I addressed, pinpoints at the fact that freezing, whether we freeze the baselines or we freeze the outer maritime boundaries, just all these legal strategies to maintain the current existing maritime spaces are taking place in a highly political scenario. And we haven't talked so much about the geopolitical framework in which all of these legal strategies are being displayed. I remember the question, the question that assumed that there is already an existing consensus. Not only there is an existing consensus, but I suppose that the declaration of the Pacific Island Forum will create a lot of opposition, formal opposition by third states, which have direct interest in seeing areas that are currently under the jurisdiction of a state becoming the high seas, because of the, especially of the economic benefits that one can get from having direct access to those newly freed areas, not only to navigate, but also for important fishing. That also makes me take this last chance to say that I think we should really look very closely at the reactions from third states to the declaration of the Forum of Pacific Island States in the year to come, especially maybe before the UN General Assembly and other UN organs. And also, I wonder whether this declaration is just one first step in the strategy that really works better is the conclusion of maritime delimitation agreements. And the Pacific Island region has been great at doing that. Between 2003 and 2014, I think there were 12 new maritime delimitation agreements that were adopted in a region that did not know any of them. I don't think all of those maritime all of the borders have been delimited. And of course, that's a long process that takes a lot of negotiation between the parties involved. But by adopting this declaration under the umbrella of the regional organization, these states are taking a unilateral measure jointly and perhaps saving some time while they continue the negotiation of the maritime delimitation agreements that will have a less controversial state before UNCLOS and are generally protected by pacta sunt servanda, cardinal principle of international law. Yes.
Thank you. Yes. Professor Masles, you have floor.
Yes, thank you. But after three experts who spoke before me, I have hardly anything to add really on the relation between sea level rise and the freedom of navigation. I think this is, of course, freedom of navigation is a really important issue, which is why the second panel of today deals with precisely such issues. But I think in the context of sea level rise, it's not the prime issue. I think, well, the implications have already been pointed out. It's a political issue, it's a geopolitical issue in the South China Sea, but I see it less of a legal issue because we already have the divide between the high seas regime that includes resources and the freedom of navigation of the high seas in the exclusive economic zone. And for the 12-mile zones, we have innocent passage. So, but most of the waters, regardless of who has rights over the resources, is high seas for the purposes of navigation anyway. So I don't think it's the biggest issue, but of course it's of high geopolitical eminence in this region.
Thank you. Yeah, Professor Yulia Oran.
Thank you. Yes, like Professor Matsuluk, I have to echo that. There's much has been said on this question, but in terms of sea level rise and freedom of navigation in general, and then specifically the South China Sea, when we're talking about the South China Sea, again, I underline, it has to do with whether the areas have been accepted, recognized, and are not disputed. South China Sea is disputed, and I think it's going to take a while before that's resolved. Sea level rise, how will it impact that dispute? I think very little, to be quite honest. The dispute will probably continue despite sea level rise, and it also depends on how much it will impact. Nonetheless, having said that, navigational rights, I also agree, are probably going to be the least impacted, because even if we are talking about the change of exclusive economic zone, for example, to high seas, and this is in general, I'm not talking about the South China Sea. As we know, the exclusive economic zone also has freedom of navigation, albeit it's a little different. It's not exactly the same as the high seas. And my colleagues have already mentioned innocent passage. So frankly, I think that that is probably going to be the least impacted, but nonetheless very important. So I'll just stop here and let my colleague Clive answer.
Thank you, Professor Clive.
Thank you indeed. And I congratulate Professor Orel for her wonderful understatement regarding the South China Sea disputes continuing. I think that's indisputable, to use a word that's often used for that particular body of water. The one on the question that was raised, the sea level rise relationship to freedom of navigation, I agree with all of my colleagues regarding this being relatively limited impact, really, because we have these existing freedoms within the exclusive economic zone and instant passage within the territorial sea. The one area where I think there is potential for change is that if we go down the route of fixing baselines, and then there is a retreat in the coastline, presumably on the landward side of the baseline, there would be internal waters where a coastal state could presumably exclude navigation. Article 8, paragraph 2 of the Convention on Internal Waters deals with the issue of where internal waters are created by the declaration of strait baselines, and that innocent passage should occur within those areas of internal waters that so created by the strait baselines. But we're not creating strait baselines in this context of fixing baselines. So there is a potential issue related to freedom of navigation there. If we're expanding internal waters, but there isn't clearly a concomitant right of innocent passage through those newly created, extended, expanded internal waters, then there is a freedom of navigation issue that could occur. But of course, that could be something that is negotiated and allowed for in any future negotiations on this specific issue of fixing baselines, limits, and boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 2 hours of a live discussion on legal perspective on baseline, maritime delimitation, and future ocean governance. Yeah. So I thank you to all the panelists for the active participation and share your knowledge and experience on sea level rise, implication, Vietnamese and regional audience. Yeah. To raise public awareness on sea level rise and promotion of international law to combat with the unprecedented event sea level rise on the legal certainty, predictability, yeah, and stability. Thank you very much, and good luck for all of you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Thao, and thank you, our distinguished panelists, and thank you, your online audience, for your excellent questions. The distinguished guest, normally we would have a happy hour with coffee, but this is online, so we will take a short technical break. We'll come back at 4:30, which is in exactly 29 minutes for the second sessions on the freedom and safety of navigation. So feel free to stick around. See you later.